Welcome back to The Power of Pensions, accelerating action towards net zero. Before the break, we explored 3 potential levers that can be pulled to make net zero portfolios a reality. But to decarbonise our investment portfolios and resolve the complex issues that we will face, we will require collaboration that goes far beyond our asset management partnerships. And it is the power of this wider net of collaborations that we're going to explore in our second panel, comprising representatives from some of the major global investor initiatives and frameworks with whom Phoenix Group are currently working. It is my pleasure to introduce Eike Pfeiffer from the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, Giel Linthorst from the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, Ben Pincombe from Climate Action 100+, and Tony Burden from Make My Money Matter. Again, there will be an opportunity to ask questions during this panel discussion. Please submit your questions using the Q&A tab below. Let me now hand over to James Wild, Chief Sustainability Officer at Phoenix Group, who will host this panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. We've heard today all about the urgent need to combat climate change, the critical role the finance sector has to play, and the work Phoenix are doing in partnership to start to decarbonise investment portfolios in practice. The reality is that many of the market conditions and approaches needed to unlock finance at the scale required are either nascent or need to be strengthened. This means collaboration across the investment ecosystem will be imperative to accelerate the solutions we all need. At Phoenix, we're working with key stakeholders to help inform and drive the debate, and very importantly, facilitate the rapid implementation of best practice. I'm delighted to be joined by a number of the groups we're working with here today on this panel. In the context of combating climate change, to my mind, there are 3 key ways collaboration can accelerate change. The first is business and the finance community working with government to help inform the policy and regulatory framework that will enable capital to flow in practice. The second, working together to define best practice, harmonised approaches that we can all use and enable clear, comparable communication of the impact achieved in areas from target setting to the investment frameworks we just heard about. And third, joining forces to drive impact and the coordinated rollout of new solutions, whether that be partnering to raise awareness of opportunities, for example with end consumers, or working together to drive change by setting common expectations and amplifying our influence, for example through coordinated engagement with the companies we're investing in, or by setting common supply chain standards. The fantastic speakers we have on this panel are representing organisations that are pulling all 3 of these levers. I'm delighted that we're joined by Eike Pfeiffer, Senior Project Manager at the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, who is seconded from Allianz Investment Management, where she's a Vice President. The Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance is an international group of institutional investors delivering on a bold commitment to transition their investment portfolios to net zero by 2050. Eike is leading work across the Alliance with a focus on financing the transition and sectoral pathways to net zero. We have Giel Linthorst, Executive Director of the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, who are developing the first ever global greenhouse gas accounting and reporting standard for the finance industry. We have Ben Pincombe, Head of Stewardship, Climate Change at PRI. Ben coordinates the Climate Action 100+ initiative, which is an investor-led initiative aiming to ensure the world's largest emitters take on the necessary actions for climate change. And finally, Tony Burden, CEO of Make My Money Matter, who, as we have heard from Richard Curtis, are leading a campaign to give people more voice and choice around how their money is invested and to ensure it's invested sustainably and responsibly. You can see that we have speakers from organisations that span the full investment ecosystem and stages, from target setting and commitments, to portfolio measurement, to active stewardship, to consumer engagement. So without further ado, I'd like to invite each of our panellists to briefly introduce their organisations and what they're aiming to achieve. Then we'll have time to discuss some of the key issues that need to be overcome across the investment ecosystem in a Q&A session. So I'd like to start by inviting Elke from the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance take us through the work they're doing in creating a framework for setting net zero goals. Over to you, Elke.
Thank you so much, James, for introducing me, and thank you so much for inviting me, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, to this exciting event and great and very important panel discussion. So the members of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance committed to decarbonize investment portfolios by 2050, setting science-based targets in 5-year steps on a 1.5 degree low to no overshoot path, engaging with all stakeholders, so together in this group, so with asset managers, with companies, with sector associations, with governments and index providers, data providers, and various other groups. The commitment is also to report in public these targets and to assess every 5 years and to report progress annually, aligns internally. So watch out for the first annual progress report, which the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance is going to publish tomorrow. Start now with the target setting and implementation. Starting in 2030 is too late. The IPCC report emphasizes the urgency. If we move on emitting on current levels, the carbon budget for a 1.5 degree limiting will be exhausted in 7 years already, so in 2028. Therefore, the members work together on a target setting approach, which is very comprehensive, covering 4 layers. The first layer is a sub-portfolio decarbonization target for listed equity, listed corporate bonds, and real estate to start. Next year, we will add infrastructure projects and possibly the year after sovereign bonds, working together with PCAF on this effort. So every year we want to enhance and add more asset classes to have finally a decarbonization target for the whole investment portfolio. The range for the year for the first 5 years, so for 2025 is -16% to -29%. Engagement targets are set. We give guidance on intensity-based sector decarbonization targets, offering the One Earth climate model as a benchmark. And last but not least, the asset owners work together on giving guidance for financing transition target reporting to show growth climate solution investments year by year. What is important? Asset owners need to work together. This is more efficient than asset owners working on their own. It's a higher engagement potential. We commonly work on global standards and best practices, and we share experience, which is most efficient. And this is what the Alliance is also wanting to do, connecting the dots, being a platform for being a platform connecting and being informed by academia and scientists to work together with initiatives and groups working on disclosure and methodologies, but also engaging and discussing with index providers. The Alliance is also part of OS Climate, which is a huge effort to provide transparent carbon emissions data. For now, so today, the international group of asset owners within the Alliance are 53 members with a 9.2 trillion assets under management in US dollar. Thank you. Over to you, back, James.
Excellent, thanks Elke. And that's so exciting, that scale, that 9.2 trillion, and the urgency with which you're kind of acting as well, setting near-term targets. I think it's so exciting. Thank you, Elke. I'd like to now pass on to Gil from the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials to tell us more about what he's doing in developing best practice finance emissions measurement. Over to you, Gil.
Thanks, James. Really honored to be on this panel. Happy to tell more about PCAF, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. This is an open source collaboration of financial institutions, started in 2015 in the Netherlands. Then in 2018 it moved to North America, and in September 2019 it went global under the leadership of 8 financial institutions. This was globalized as an initiative by the financial sector for the financial sector. Currently we have over 160 financial institutions being part of the network, and we're really proud that Phoenix is also part of this network. These 160 financial institutions comprise of banks, investors, asset managers, asset owners, insurance companies, and development banks. So all types of financial institutions are part of this network, and they collaborate to standardize the way they measure and disclose emissions related to their financial activities. Currently, we have this amount, so 160 financial institutions being part of the network, and out of that group, 20 financial institutions contributed to develop the first ever global greenhouse gas accounting and reporting standard. That standard was launched in November last year, and that standard is now also being integrated and recommended by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD, as the key metrics for reporting of financial institutions on their climate impact of their financial activities. And we are very pleased to see that recommendations by the TCFD. We like to grow the network. It's free to join for financial institutions, and we hope to grow the network to over 250 financial institutions next year. On our website you can see all the financial institutions that are part of this network, and as I said, happy to be on this panel with Phoenix as a partner in this collaboration. Back to you, James.
Amazing story of growth, isn't it, over those short years, and to be recognised as an established standard in the TCFD guidance, I think is fantastic. And I have to say, at Phoenix, we were the first UK insurer to sign up, and we're really excited to be part of the membership, because I think what's that famous kind of management quote, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. We need a kind of harmonised way to measure carbon emissions, so fantastic work, thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Ben from Climate Action 100+, and their powerful work in clubbing together as investors to increase influence on companies. Over to you, Ben.
Sure, thanks, James. So just as a recap, so my name is Ben Pinkham. So I head our stewardship activities on climate change at the PRI, and together with a number of other investor networks, we're responsible for coordinating the Climate Action 100+. So this, as James mentioned, is an initiative, an investor initiative to ensure that the world's largest greenhouse gas emitters are taking the necessary action on climate change. And to date, we've had, since 2017, when we launched the initiative, we've had more than 600 institutional investors sign up to the initiative, with more than 60 trillion in US dollars in assets under management sign up to the initiative. And they're engaging 166 corporates on a variety of different goals and topics relating to climate change. And those 166 companies represent the majority of listed emissions in terms of their impact. So the very premise that being this is a stewardship initiative, and that's a powerful lever in terms of addressing systemic issues like climate change, in addition to what you're investing in specifically. So the Climate Action 100+, as you can see, has 3 high-level goals, which can largely be bucketed into, firstly, implementing a strong governance framework, really ensuring that there's strong board accountability. The second goal is also asking investors to engage companies to enhance their disclosure, particularly in line with the TCFD recommendations. And the final, most important goal of the initiative is that companies take action to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in line with net zero by 2050, which is what's specified by the Paris Agreement goal to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this is a global engagement initiative, and the investors, the networks that convene the initiative coordinate those and facilitate those engagements and those dialogue. And in addition to that coordination element, there are a couple of strategic projects that we work on. The first, which I wanted to highlight, is the Climate Action 100 Plus Net Zero Company Benchmark. In the previous panel, you heard Eva talk a little bit about that, but this is a really key tool for us, which we first launched in March 2021, earlier this year. And it's designed to evaluate company performance in terms of addressing climate change, and also outline the expectations of investors and inform the key engagement priorities that investors have when they're in dialogue with these companies. So that's going to be a really important tool. We're planning another iteration in March 2022. It's the next version of that. In addition to that, we also have a new work stream on global sector strategies. So in addition to looking at company level engagement, we're really trying to look at a more holistic perspective of the sector. What are the challenges facing that sector? What are the technological barriers? How can we overcome them? And perhaps look at some of more the strategic interventions that investors, companies and other stakeholders can make in terms of decarbonising that entire industry. Earlier this year, we published something on aviation. We've also got a paper out on steel, food and beverage, and we're going to do more of this as well. So those are a couple of things that we're working on. But I'm really pleased to be on this panel and look forward to our discussion shortly.
Brilliant, thanks Ben. And that's so, again, the scale with 60 trillion of assets under administration, but then I love those two levers, the kind of strategic at the sector level, working out what's the art of the possible, then within that holding companies to account against a benchmark. I think that's really, really powerful. Tony, well, we'll move on to you next, and Make My Money Matter and the exciting work you're doing in mobilising the consumer as a driver of change.
Great, well thanks a lot James, it's great to be here. And you'll have heard from Richard Curtis earlier, you know, we're a campaign trying to give people more voice and choice around how their money's invested and to get that money invested sustainably and responsibly. And we know in the UK that 80% of people surveyed are worried about the climate emergency, but we also know that at least 2/3 of people in pension funds want their money invested sustainably. So this is a really important issue for people. We launched in June last year. We had Richard there, but also Mark Carney, Helen Dean from Nest, Russell Pico from the HSBC scheme. And straight after our launch, we focused on campaigning around getting UK pension funds to align to net zero. And we tried to mobilise pension members to write to their pension fund and ask for a net zero pension, and we saw thousands of them do so. We also worked closely with businesses and other employers to get them to commit and sign up to a Green Pensions Charter, where they've committed to work with their pension provider or their pension trustees to get their workplace scheme aligned to net zero. And we've seen 70 businesses sign up to that, including IKEA, Tesco, EY, Travis Perkins and many others. And it's this sort of individual member pressure coupled with pressure from employers onto the industry that's helping to push industry to align to net zero. And since we launched that campaign last year, we've seen commitments made now, including from Phoenix Group. So thank you very much for that. You know, a robust commitment to net zero, including crucially halving emissions this decade. We've seen £800 billion of commitments made in the UK, which is absolutely fantastic. But it still leaves just under 2 trillion not yet aligned, with no announcements having been made. So there's a lot to do to get that money aligned to net zero. At the moment, those pension funds are driving the climate emergency, and that's not what people who have a pension want. Next year, we'll continue to drive on getting these remaining pension funds to align to net zero, but we'll also set up an approach to hold pension funds to account for the promises they've made and to traffic light UK pensions against those commitments. So pension members, businesses who provide schemes can see what their schemes are doing and see the progress that's being made. But what I'd like to do now is just show a video that we're using on social media as a way to engage people with their pensions. Pensions are boring, but they're also really powerful, and we really want people to engage with their money and try and push for them that money to be invested sustainably. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Desmond, an old-style default pension.
And I'm Susan, a new sustainable pension. It's pretty simple really. By switching from him to me, you can help save the planet right now.
Why are you young people always in such a hurry? Look, you've got to trust the people in power. If you really want the climate fixed and new jobs created and all that other good stuff, just wait for them to sort it out. It's much easier that way.
Not really. Around the world, there's a whopping great $50 trillion in our pensions, and we can make sure it's invested in the right things. We're the people with the money, which means we're the people with the power.
I warned you, young people in these newfangled pensions want all the power.
Precisely. Use your power right now. Get a pension to be proud of.
I'm starting to get a bit depressed.
Excellent, thanks Tony. I mean, that's so exciting. I think it's just so powerful to engage the consumer on this, and I think get them more engaged in their pensions. You know, it's exciting the kind of impact you can have through your investment portfolio and encourage people to save more, because we know there's a big savings gap as well as creating that pull of the investment industry. And as Andy Briggs in his keynote earlier said, you know, we want the whole industry committing to that alignment to net zero using the framework that Elke introduced. So I think it's so exciting, your work, and we're very pleased to be collaborating with you. We now move into the Q&A section, so I do encourage you to submit questions. The first question I wanted to ask actually though is about data. It's come up through the course of the day, and good data is a key enabler of making investment decisions and also reporting the impact of our investments to consumers, as we were just talking about. This represents a significant challenge in the context of climate change, both in terms of the consistency and coverage of backward-looking data on assets' performance, but also critically, the difficulty of forward assessment against future scenarios. It's very timely because the government yesterday launched a green finance roadmap aiming to improve the quality and consistency of sustainability information and reporting. And labelling, actually, across companies, investment portfolios and investment products. And I guess my first question is there an opportunity to collaborate to ensure the information investors and consumers need is available? I'll perhaps start with Elke from the perspective of an investor.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very important question. So investors, basically, the investment decisions are based on forward-looking expectations. So data is key, especially forward-looking data. So to have a carbon footprinting is the very beginning. But what is important that asset owners or investors get information in hand about forward-looking decarbonisation plans, about CapEx plans, to base their investment decisions on that. And therefore, we need standardization and comparability. Otherwise, this investment portfolio steering is simply not possible. So it's not a question well, in my view, this collaboration is desperately needed. Otherwise, we do not see efficient carbon emissions decarbonisation as we see, or efficient financial markets. We also need to see efficient, carbon information, and therefore this global standardization is key. So just to mention, as a collaboration with PICA, for example, on carbon accounting, but also SBTI, like one standard setting in target setting. So aligning and connecting all these groups who already started setting standards, this is desperately needed. And one other activity I just want to share, I mentioned it before, this open source climate. So it's together really with Microsoft, Amazon, Goldman Sachs, KPMG, BNP Paribas, and others, an initiative where to work on open source climate data to ensure and receive basically this transparent data for everyone. So these initiatives are important, and therefore collaboration is key.
No, I couldn't agree more, Elke, and I think you raise a really important point, actually. We need good access to harmonised data, but a simple way of accessing it as well, because if you think from a company's perspective, in the previous panel, I think it was Clive was saying he gathers a huge number of data points on ESG. If every investor was asking for that many data points, the company's just becoming a data producer, as opposed to that kind of open source, harmonized set of key metrics that we can hold them to account on their future scenario. I think it's very exciting. That's really great. Gil, this is your world, data. Forward and backward looking frameworks. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Within PCAF and the network, we look a lot at the data and also at backward-looking data and of course forward-looking data. And I think financial institutions need both, and that's important to notice. Backward-looking data is of course often used to monitor progress, because of course you want to hold your investees, your companies in your portfolio accountable for the plans that they have and the targets that they have set up. So monitoring with backward-looking data, you can identify if they are meeting their goals, if your portfolio is decarbonizing over time in line with the Paris Agreement. So backward-looking data has a specific purpose, while forward-looking data is often combined with backward-looking data to also look at future plans of companies and targets and investment plans. So that is often also used for benchmarking performance, but also to develop a strategy to engage with certain companies in your portfolio that are maybe behind on target setting or are behind on taking action. So they serve both a purpose, and indeed the collaboration across the globe is needed to harmonize both type of data sets. Within PCAF, we have developed an open source database where every financial institution can feed in that looks at backward-looking data. So what are the emissions of certain sectors, also covering all types of asset classes, like even motors, motor vehicle loans, mortgages, business loans, but also of course listed equity and bonds. And I think that's important, that we provide access to financial institutions to this harmonized data sets, and that also more companies disclose this data into a format that can directly be used by financial institutions. And I think on backward-looking data, there's more harmonization already, but especially on forward-looking data, there's still a lot of work to do to harmonize that with also the emerging set of tools that come out, for instance, on implied temperature rating, etc., to harmonize those type of data sets going forward. So still work to do, but I think looking at both type of data set is crucial to drive change within the financial sector and in the real economy in the end.
No, thanks, Gil. I think that's very insightful, and I think that harmonisation and open access, I think, is really exciting again. This gets quite complicated quite quickly. Again, in that last panel, there was talk about a dashboard of metrics, and it's getting quite sophisticated quite quickly. And for the consumer, we want to bring this to life in a compelling way. What kind of information do consumers need, Tony, do you think?
Well, a normal person wouldn't even use the phrase a dashboard of metrics.
Exactly.
You know, so we're starting from quite a low base, really. Most people don't understand how their pension works. In our surveys, the majority of people don't even know that it's invested. And of course, we know it's invested in thousands of businesses and other assets. So they find themselves accidental investors. You know, they're climate campaigners investing in coal, vegans investing in meat farming. So I think we need all of that data sets that's described, standardised, and then turned into the kind of information normal people can understand. And one of the things we've asked from pension companies is that they report to their members every year on the impact their investments are making and the progress they are making towards getting to net zero year on year. And that will then allow consumers to make choices. So I like what the government has done on greening finance, because we're going to get this in the UK now. Standard disclosures, maybe even a kind of label or kite mark that will allow consumers to differentiate. But the beauty of this will come when people will look at one pension and say, look at the impact of that, I just don't like that. And here's another pension, you know, with a much better impact, returns are similar, I'm going to move, or I want my employer to move me. So that will be where people then start to have power over their money because they're better informed. So it's such a strategic, powerful issue. It will democratise finance when people at last understand the impact their money has and the potential for it to do good. Because it's not just decarbonising, it's investing in climate solutions. So you can report on that, and then people will really make these informed decisions, which will be fantastic.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really exciting vision. Maybe going on to my next question. There's a need for all companies to set net zero commitments and clear transition plans, and very much moving beyond pledges to action. And again, the government Green Finance Roadmap that came out yesterday indicated that it wanted companies to disclose transition plans in the future, which is marvellous news. In fact, we work with WWF to advocate for this. It's great. But one key question is one thing publishing a transition plan, the other is how do we test the sincerity of those transition plans? And just using the example of the UK economy, the Committee on Climate Change do a fantastic job holding the government to account on their carbon plans. And I guess my question is, are investors the Committee on Climate Change equivalent for companies? And maybe Ben, I'll start with you on this one because it's so close to the work of Climate Action 100.
Yeah, certainly. So on the sincerity of transition plans, certainly within Climate Action 100 Plus, this is partly the purpose of this benchmark that we've developed. So it's designed to evaluate company performance and ideally the sort of the adequacy and sufficiency of decarbonisation and transition plans. So the way we approach it in this benchmark we've developed is, we worked with a number of different data and research providers, the Transition Pathway Initiative, which you might have heard about already in previous panels, Carbon Tracker, Influence Map, 2 Degrees Investing Initiative. And with them, we bucket the assessments into 2 different types, essentially testing the adequacy of company disclosure, but also testing the alignment of company actions. So we have a series of indicators and metrics that cover a range of different areas, start looking at not only long-term targets, but also medium and short-term targets, whether they're aligned with the Paris Agreement goal and 1.5 degrees Celsius. We have indicators on assessing decarbonisation strategies, also the alignment of capital expenditure and future investments, so really getting to the idea of putting your money where your mouth is, essentially. Also assessments on governance, on disclosure, and also some new ones on just transition, and also we're adding one on climate accounting, so really importantly, making sure that that front-end narrative matches the back-end accounts. And when we released this first set of assessments in March 2021, of the 160 companies we assessed, we found that although a lot of them are making great pledges and commitments, there's still quite a lot more that needs to happen in terms of concrete action and sort of implementation. So if we looked at the results from those 160 companies, and we found that more than half the companies, although they were setting a net zero ambition, and also many were setting a medium-term target to 2023. Only 29% of the companies had a long-term greenhouse gas emission reduction target tied to the Paris Agreement, and only 11% had a medium-term target to 2035 aligned with the Paris Agreement. So really there's a lot more to spell out in terms of how you're actually going to get there and aligning that. I mentioned CapEx as well, future investment, and when we get into decarbonisation strategy and transition plans, it's all well and good setting a net zero goal overall and ambition, but you then really need to spell out what actions you're going to take. And the CapEx one is really one that needs to be addressed in particular. Of the 160 companies we assessed, only 4% had capital aligned expenditure. So a lot of companies still planning to invest heavily in new oil and gas and polluting fuels. So that's something that really needs to be addressed. And even on some of the broader issues such as governance as well, again, there's a lot of increasingly sort of board oversight. 87% of companies have some kind of board oversight on climate change, which is great. But then in terms of actually incentivizations, I think it's only a third of companies have some kind of executive pay scheme linked to greenhouse gas emission targets. Likewise, on disclosure, many companies, 72%, are now committing to align with the TCFD, but only 11% of them have actually a scenario test against a 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. So that kind of gives you a bit of a flavor of what we're trying to do in terms of transitioning, and a lot of great things happening in terms of pledges, but really a long way to go to turn that into concrete real-world outcomes. And that's really something investors are engaging on as a matter of priority, to try and really put the meat on the bones of how that decarbonisation is going to happen, and rather rapidly. And that's something we hope to see some progress on in the next iteration of the benchmark, which is due early next year.
It's really powerful, and those stats are incredible, aren't they? As Elke said earlier, it's about forward plans and the kind of capital allocation, and the fact that only, was it 4%? We're aligned to net zero, and I mean, that's just amazing, isn't it? And shows also the power, if such a big club of investors then hold all those companies to account using all their statistics, it can really make a difference. Gil, anything you'd like to add on this question?
Yeah, I think next to investors, I think also banks play an important role, and you see more and more banks stepping up also with sustainability linked loans that they provide to companies, where they also put pressure on the company to meet certain goals. So I think banks can play a role, but of course in the end also policymakers, and NGOs, and even also public play a role as stakeholders to these companies to help them account for their climate action. And I think it is indeed a complex ecosystem, but I think we need all stakeholders to push on companies to deliver on their goals. And often this can also be complex, because goals can also range across the value chain of companies. So they also need to engage with their partners. And I think there's also a role for financial institutions to play, to help companies to leverage their network and their value chain, like their suppliers, to also step up. So in the end, this is a multi-stakeholder collaboration that needs to happen to drive change at company level.
Really, really interesting, Gil. I love that view of kind of the system level and supply chain. And as investors, and probably investors in multiple of the companies in that supply chain, we've got real levers we can pull. I think that's really exciting. One more question for me, because I'm keen we go to the audience. And you mentioned there the complexity of the transition, Gil. The shift to a low carbon economy does represent a complex fundamental transition, and some of the sectors that are most exposed, some of the ones that Ben's work is looking at, such as oil and gas, will need to shift business model over time. How do we tell this story to consumers in a simple and compelling way and get the right balance in our investment approach? This isn't necessarily about exiting, it's about transition. Maybe Tony, starting with you.
Yeah, it is complicated, and but let's try and simplify it. In a way, it's about using, again, your pension power. So pension members are shareholders in all of these companies. So how do they exert their power? So what you see in public campaigning is the divestment campaigns. So saying, look, these are wicked companies causing harm, let's just divest. Well, that's one approach, and it's that sort of threat to companies, if you don't up your game, we're going to divest, is a really important part of what I see as a toolkit. So you've got divestment on one end, and for a business model like coal, of course you should be divesting. We need to make coal extinct. But for oil and gas companies, what we want to do is drive their transition. So don't just walk away, use your vote. So what's really important then as asset owners, investors, is to engage with those companies and say, okay, what's your transition plan to net zero? Is it serious? And as Ben was highlighting, a lot of them, the majority, are not serious. And as shareholders, you've got to say, right, we can't accept that. We'll vote out your plan, your transition plan, at the annual general meeting. Or we'll vote out the remuneration package of your top management, right, if you don't align, or we'll vote you off the board. We'll sack you and get people in who are capable of managing that transition. And of course, it's a complex transition. So, if you're thinking, say, of Shell or BP, if they want to reduce emissions, they can just sell some of their assets that are dirty and polluting and look greener. But those assets still operate and cause harm to our planet. So it may be that with those businesses, a proper transition is that they should be decommissioning some of these assets as they invest more in renewable energy and ultimately becoming renewable energy providers. And all of us as shareholders need to be driving that, demanding it, and that's where people should use their pension power.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, that kind of using that shareholder angle and bringing to life that transition. Elke, maybe handing over to you from the investor perspective.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I could just echo what Tony just said. We need to have real world impact, and divesting, you won't have real world impact. It's really about collaboration, financing the transition, and commonly work together. So really with all stakeholders, with the sector association, with governments, to really find solutions like, for example, blended finance, to reduce green premiums, not really to reduce the green premiums, but make those investments really a case for institutional investors, which have a fiduciary duty. So these are like the forward-looking this needs to happen to really drive change. So divesting might be a last resort. I agree, but it's not a solution for example, for a sector. So if we ask for no new coal, phase out coal, divesting from coal, yes. If we say no new fossil fuel projects and gas, yes. But on the other hand, you need to have to finance the solution, right? So the renewables and infrastructure. And there is so much to do, especially in collaboration with governments. They need to have master plans. They need to basically provide the environment for investors to enable investing. And they might also need to provide concessional capital to reduce the risks, which we are especially seeing in the emerging markets. And we all know emerging markets are key. So collaboration, again, is key. And divestment as such won't have a real world impact. So just echoing what Tony said.
Thank you, Elke. And I'm just reminded of the speech by Allegra earlier in the day, where there was a later target for coal phase out in the developing world as opposed to the developed. So it is a journey, and we need to support companies on that journey, don't we? There's a great question actually online that's come in from Hayley. The just transition is important. How can we collaborate to unlock social change and levelling up? Anyone on the panel like to take that question?
I can kick off on that. I mentioned earlier on in the benchmark for the Climate Action 100 Plus, we've just added an indicator on just transition. So looking at the impacts on workers, communities that are considered as part of that. And just back to this discussion on emerging markets, it's especially important. And many of the companies that we're targeting in Climate Action 100 Plus in certain regions, such as Poland, in Asia, in South Africa, the entire economies are dependent on heavily fossil fuel kind of producing impacts. So it's really an enabler, we view, in terms of trying to speeding up that transition. There need to be incentives. There needs to be a plan for what you're going to do with workers and communities. You can't just shut down an entire industry overnight that a lot of the country depends on. So it's really important that that's part of the conversation and is really used as an enabler to transition that. So that's something increasingly that we're going to be asking, and especially important for emerging markets as well.
Anyone else want to come in on?
Maybe just add, I think it depends on the sector as well. So I remember when I worked in government looking at South Africa, heavily dependent on coal, but also employment heavily dependent on coal. How do you transition? It's really hard, and that will need public investment as well as they make that transition. But when you've got an oil and gas company, what you have are a lot of people who are used to financing deals, who are used to dealing with complex infrastructure projects, and those skills are readily transferable to putting wind farms in the North Sea. If you can put an oil rig in the North Sea, you can do a wind farm. So some of that transition is more ready than others. So the real worry, I think, on the just transition, especially in emerging markets, developing countries, is around coal and the industries around coal. And I think that just will need more public money to support that and make that viable, while then investing in the new technologies that create new jobs.
Yeah, I think you're right, Tony. I think there's a really interesting story about creating green jobs so that people can transition their employment. And I think there's a really interesting regional story in the UK as well as globally, isn't there? And you are seeing the growth of the offshore wind industry and kind of trying to onshore the manufacturing and create jobs in places like the northeast. I think it's a really exciting area. And you mentioned policy and public money. I mean, it's been a big theme of the day, and it has to be, doesn't it, with COP coming up. Strong policy is going to be a necessary condition for us to be able to transition our portfolios. Maybe Elke, what's the opportunity to collaborate on policy in this space?
As you know, it's the UN-convened Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance with PRI, so both organizations, of course, well connected to governments, and together with the asset owners who are also connected to their domestic governments, I think, and together with other groups, this is very strong. So to sit together with governments and work, basically work out what are the plans needed. Again, investors need a stable legislation. Without stable legislation, you won't see money flows. So again, also here, forward-looking plans, I call them master plans, however you want to call it. This is desperately needed for investors to giving really or providing the ground for investing. And in addition, of course, also public money. If we again think about emerging markets, as the risks for institutional investors are simply very high within the fiduciary duty to enable investing at a large scale. So if you really want to scale up, it needs to be a public-private partnership in connection with stable regulation, with plans which are connected, where all these industries are connected. So every single country has a different environment, and this needs to be understood. So in my view, again, collaboration is key with all stakeholders, sectors, with governments, with investors. And you need to have the power you all have. So the connections which have those groups, as I said, but also the single stakeholders with their or single like investors or also asset managers in their countries and with their connection they have in their respective countries to enable and to support the governments in coming up with those plans.
Thanks, Elke. I think you couldn't be more right. I think those master plans are absolutely critical, and it's a pivotal moment in the UK. The UK government are about to launch their climate change strategy, their master plan, and I agree entirely. I think investors can play a really big role in giving the government the kind of the freedom to set ambitious policies and really highlight the policies that are going to unlock finance, make that business case real. I'd like to thank all our panellists for such a really engaging debate and hearing about their fantastic work. Before we close though, I'd like to ask each of you for a kind of key takeaway for our audience around the real opportunity associated with collaboration. Maybe starting with Elke.
Yeah, climate change is a global common burden, and therefore it needs to be solved all together. So working together on common standards, on common tool sets, not leaving behind the most vulnerable people and societies. So fast and concerted action is key.
Gil.
Yeah, thanks for this question. I'm very positive about the role of the financial sector, and I'd like to give that to the audience. I've seen the financial sector really step up over the last years, and I think if you look at the current economy is built on finance. So we have to build the new economy also on finance. So the role of finance is key, and I'm really positive that the financial sector will play its role to finance this transition.
Fantastic. Ben?
Yeah, just similar. I mean, Elke and Gil said it well. I mean, climate change is a global systemic issue. It's a collective problem. It's not just about one individual, just the financial, one sector or one financial community. It's about investors, companies, consumers, society all working together. So I think the more we collaborate, the better we'll be equipped to solve a really big problem.
And Tony?
I agree with everyone. But I think what I worry about is it's happening too slowly. So our view is that net zero should just become mandatory. And what we need is leaders from industry to be saying, actually, that's the right thing. We've done it voluntarily, but to get the laggards, it needs to be mandatory. And then that's setting things, there's clarity, everyone knows where they stand, and then we can really start to work on the task in hand.
Yeah. I think that urgency is key, and I think that role of the finance community in being part of the solution and creating that mandate for change, I think is really exciting. I mean, I've been working to address the climate change challenge my whole career for the last 20 years, and I can honestly say it's collaborations like this that we've discussed today that give me confidence that we can deliver on that urgency, deliver against this challenge. And I'd have to say I'd encourage everybody in the audience to get involved in these collaborations. That's what makes them powerful. So thank you very much.
Thank you, James, Elke, Gil, Ben and Tony for sharing your work in defining best practice. I found that a truly powerful and engaging discussion. And whilst it covered a really broad range of focus areas, the ambition to address climate change is genuinely shared by everyone. And it was empowering to see how we can all play our part in creating a new investment ecosystem.